Okay, welcome everyone. It's a little loud. I was trying to figure out if I need this mic, but it's a big room, so it's probably a good idea. So we're here to talk about business strategy for product management today. Thank you for joining me. Just a bit about me. I've been doing product management for about 10 years now. Before that, I was a software engineer and architect. I've done product roles at a bunch of different companies, both consumer and enterprise. So I like to start with the definition of strategy, because I think strategy in some ways is an often misused word. People talk about their strategy for, like, my strategy, my go-to-market strategy, or other things that are very tactical in nature. And really, strategy really isn't about things that are tactical. It's about more of your big picture thinking. And so I go to Webster's here, and it says a careful plan or method for achieving a particular goal, usually over a long period of time. So what does that mean for us in business? Our goal is sustainable competitive advantage. We want to have an advantage over our competitors that lasts for a long time. So why should we care about strategy? There's a bunch of reasons. I think it helps you figure out if you can be successful entering a market. So if you understand what the strategic dynamics are, why the market has the structure it does, goes a long way to understanding if you can be successful entering it. And it's a crystal ball too that allows us to look at nascent markets and figure out what the industry structure is going to look like down the road. Will it shake out to have just one or two main players, or will this market likely end up as a fragmented market with a lot of players? And that kind of information in advance tells you a lot about how you want to approach it. I also think strategy effects are much more pronounced now because of the internet. Geography effects are weak, things move faster, and competitive advantages last less long in innovation cycles. So it's important to kind of think about what new innovations are going to do if you do have a set of good strategic advantages now. So let's talk about some strategy frameworks. Porter's 5 Forces is kind of is like one of the most well-known strategy frameworks. If you've ever taken a strategy class in an academic setting, like an MBA, they definitely teach this one. And just also to set the context, Porter is Michael Porter. He's a professor at Harvard Business School and probably the most famous person, academic when it comes to strategy. And so what Porter tells us is that there's 5 factors that kind of affect your industry dynamics. And so on the horizontal axis here, you've got your bargaining power of your customers. So do your customers have a lot of other choices in the market? If they do, they might have high bargaining power. On the other hand, if you have something that's very unique, they can't get somewhere else, and is really important to them, then that really reduces their bargaining power, right? That comes into your pricing. And by the same token is the bargaining power of suppliers. So if you need something from one of your suppliers you can't get from somebody else, even if you're generating a lot of value and capturing it from your customer, your suppliers can go appropriate a lot of that value. Versus if all the things that go into what you need to deliver your service are pretty commodity, you can get from a lot of places, the suppliers don't have a lot of bargaining power. And so then on the vertical axis is about competition. And there's the threat of new entrants. If you're making a ton of money in an area, can a bunch of entrants come in and compete with you and lower your margins? Like the airline industry traditionally has had this. Now we've seen a lot of mergers and there's less entrants here, so that's why they're making more money now. But the other one that people don't think about a lot is threat of substitute products. Like, what is the customer's alternative? Like, a good way to think about this is if there's if the weather in Florida is bad and all the oranges get ruined, right? Oranges might get really expensive. It might be triple the cost. But you don't have to buy an orange, right? If you're hungry, you can buy an apple. So is there something that the customers can do instead of using your product or service? And in the middle is competitive rivalry of the industry. And so when we think about competitive rivalry, this is like how many players are there and how fiercely they compete. So I work in ad tech. This is the LumaScape for ad tech. This is an industry with a lot of rivalry. It's very, very competitive. And the more competitors you have, the harder it is to, the less pricing power you're going to have. So Porter tells us, he kind of lays out 3 generic strategies for how to get that competitive advantage. And I think 2 of them are related about whether you want to be different, differentiation strategy, do something that's different and better than your competitors, or he says narrow your market scope. And so essentially you're differentiating on a subset of the market. And this is the one I think that as product managers, that's what we spend our time thinking about, like how to make our products better and different than competition. The other strategy he outlines is cost leadership. I'm going to be cheaper than the competition. The thing about, there's a reason he actually doesn't say price leadership, he says cost leadership. The only way you can be successful at being like the low price provider and making a lot of money is if your costs are lower than everyone else. Because otherwise, your competitors can just copy you. Okay, let's move on to some key concepts. For all strategies, the biggest threat that you have to that strategy being successful is that your competitors will just copy it, right? Even if you add, not sure what happened there. Okay, we're back. So, okay, it does not like the slide. That's really strange. All right. Go back, is it really good? Couldn't be the slide. So if so as product managers, even if we come up with something that is really unique and different and put it in our products, like how much advantage does that give us, right? Oftentimes, it just gives us an advantage until the competitors go and implement that same functionality. So that might give you a few months, or depending on how long it takes to implement, or longer. But this is when you're evaluating your strategy. This is like the key, like one of these things that you really have to consider, because this is where most strategies fall down. And here Porter tells us the essence of strategy is in the activities. Choosing to perform activities differently or to perform different activities than rivals do. And so you have to be different. You have to be able to do something different than your competitors to get the advantage. And so the next concept I want to talk about is how much value can you capture? Like, businesses tend to think a lot about revenue. But the revenue you get is the share of value that you capture. And the kind of important concept here is that you cannot capture more value than you create. And so, and because of that, that gives you a good way to sort of strategically evaluate a business or potential business. And so to kind of get a little bit more formal about it, we'll define value created as the customer's willingness to pay, not what you charge them, but the most that they would pay for your product or service, minus the cost of delivering it. And when we say cost, people usually think about cost in kind of an accounting sense. Like, okay, like I have this cost of goods sold on my income statement, but that's not really the cost we're talking about here. This is not the economic cost of even a marginal unit. This includes the minimum return to be in business. So you gotta how much to get investment in this, like how much would this have to generate? So that's the actual value. That's the value created. And then I want to talk about the concept of added value. The amount added value is the amount of aggregate value in the entire industry that would disappear if you weren't there, right? So if your product is exactly the same as your competitors and you disappear, they would just use the competitor's product and they would be no better or worse off, in which case your added value is 0. Versus if you do something unique and the competitor's products don't do it as well, and if your customers were forced to switch to the competitor's product, they'd be getting less value. Then that decrease in value is the value you're adding. And so the important point here is that you can't capture more value than you create. you cannot generate a return that is higher than the added value you're creating, like above what the baseline is for the industry. Like if we're all the same, we all get the basic industry return, but to do better, you have to create added value.
So how do you differentiate the created value versus captured value?
Well, so captured is revenue, right? Like how much, what pricing power I had, how much I was able to charge more than my competitor charges. But the value is the total between what the consumer would have paid, the customer would have paid, and what your kind of total costs are. So I actually worked through an example here to help with this. So let's say I paid $850 for my iPhone. The most I would pay is $900. And we'll say that the cost is $275, right? And Tim Cook always says these numbers I get off the internet for costs are wrong, but they'll serve for this purpose. So the total value created is $625. But what is the added value that Apple adds? And so that I have to look at what my alternative is if there were no iPhones, right? I guess I'd have to go buy an Android phone, which I don't like as much. And maybe I would pay $560 for that phone. I'd probably choose this like OnePlus phone that's out there. And it costs them $230 to make that phone. So the value that creates is $330. But if we subtract these two numbers, it looks like I did my math slightly wrong. I think that should be $295. Apple's added value is $295 or $300. That is pretty impressive on a product that costs $850. You take the percentage of $295 out of $850, it's huge. This is why Apple earns like almost all the profits in the cell phone industry, because they have tremendous added value versus their competition. You look at the other players out there, right, their added value is not very high because, let's say I preferred Android phones and maybe my top preference would be a Samsung. But if Samsung disappeared, there's a whole bunch of other phones I can buy that are about the same price and the producers have the same cost basis. So their added value tends to be near zero. And so this huge profit Apple earns is all because of this added value. Okay, so now that we've got some of the concepts behind us, I want to look at like 3 ways you can get competitive advantage. So the first is that cost advantage we were talking about. Like if I have lower costs than my competitor, I can either use that to just get above average margins, because I can charge the same price as them and just make more money than they do, or I can use that to undercut them. And so like the great canonical example of cost advantage is Southwest Airlines. Those of you who have done MBAs, like I did one, and they probably did 5 or 6 cases on Southwest. Business school professors love Southwest, but it's because they really kind of exemplify this idea about doing things differently to get an advantage, right? So they have a bunch of unique activities. They only fly 737s because that reduces their cost. They don't have to train their pilots on different things. Their pilots can fly any of their planes. They have the fastest turnarounds in the the industry. They still have this. United spent like a whole bunch of effort. They started even like a sub-brand to try to improve their turnarounds. They still can't go as fast as these guys. Historically, they've flown to smaller airports. They've started flying to some bigger airports, but smaller airports both have lower landing fees, and you can typically turn faster because you spend less time with the plane on the ground. And kind of one of the important things to think about here is that airplanes only make money in the sky. Like we pay to go places. Like we don't pay to sit on the ground, right? So when your plane is not sitting on the ground, not flying, no money. And they do a whole bunch of other things differently. There's no seat assignments, there's no first class. They don't charge you all the fees that basically are driving the profits of the other airlines. And they typically do point-to-point service. They don't have big hubs. So they're very, very different. Do their activities, like Porter was talking about, their activities are very different than their competitors. And so if we look at their financials, this is 2016 data, we can see like their gross margins, 18.4%. That doesn't mean a lot until we compare to these other airlines. Like they have a much higher gross margin than any of these other airlines. And typically if we want to analyze airlines, we look at available seat miles. So this is the total number of seats times times the miles they fly. So Southwest gets a above average load factor. Delta's pretty high. Their revenue per mile is actually lower than all these other guys. But look at their costs, right? All those unique activities translated into a much lower cost, and so they get above average margin per mile. And so like Delta over here is also doing pretty well in these numbers because they get good revenue per mile and somewhat pretty decent cost. But Southwest is generating their whole competitive advantage on this, and these incumbents haven't been able to follow. But imitation is still a threat, right? So new entrants come along and do some of these same tricks as Southwest. JetBlue only flies A380s, less reliant on hubs, and they can generate. They've been able to imitate those things and get an even better gross margin and even lower cost per mile. Okay, so we've talked about all these things, but the key thing I want you to take away from this is that imitation is always that threat. People are always going to try to imitate. There are some other examples when it comes to cost.
Sorry, could you go tell why JetBlue?
Yeah.
Is able to emulate Southwest? Do they basically do things similar to Southwest but better or for less cost?
Yeah. I mean, so they have A320s, right? Which are they do all A320s, which is that kind of same trick Southwest did with the 737s. And I mean, some of it may be like to really compare these two numbers, maybe somewhat of a artificial comparison because JetBlue on average flies much longer flights. So like the fact that they're a little bit lower than Southwest is maybe an artifact of that because you probably get lower cost per mile when the flight gets longer. But the key thing is, right, it's not like Southwest didn't get any competition, right? That somebody else came along and said, we can do the things that you can do, even though these incumbents have never been able to figure it out. After a lot of trying. There's some other good examples here. Like one of my favorites is, it's kind of dated now, but back when we used to buy desktop computers, Dell didn't ship them to stores, you bought them direct. And the thing that was interesting about them is they didn't make them before you ordered them. So their total time that the computer was in their inventory and unsold was basically only the time it took to assemble. It was like a day. And they actually required their suppliers to station their inventory like right next to their factory. So they didn't even own, like the Intel processor that was going to get in your Dell computer, they didn't even own until after you ordered it. So this allowed them to drive much lower costs than their competitors who had to produce all these computers, ship them to big box stores, deal with the fact that box stores wanted like rebates or returns if they didn't sell. Okay, so the second source of competitive advantage I want to talk about is the network effect. And like one way to think about this is why doesn't Facebook have any successful competitors? And like actually at this point in time, this is even like a more pertinent question because there are a whole bunch of people angry at Facebook right now over their data policies. And like if you want to delete Facebook, you can do that, but you don't have any place else to go. Like there's really no competitor to them, which seems odd because they're like this really huge corporation making a ton of money. But like if you think about it from a strategic point of view, there's a reason for this. And so I want to start, they have this network effect, right? And I want to start by defining it. And it's basically the value of a product or service is increased by others using it, right? So on Facebook, the fact that all your friends are there is what defines its value. Like versus like for your refrigerator, do you care what refrigerator your neighbor uses, your friends use? It has no influence on what the value of that refrigerator is to you. But Facebook, it has, like that's the entire value. And so there's a bunch of good examples of network effects. Like you've got LinkedIn for professional, for professional social networking. You can't leave them because everyone else is there. Marketplaces also tend to exhibit this behavior. So eBay, right, for auctioning stuff, like the sort of core original market, they really have no competition. Amazon tried. Airbnb doesn't have, like they really dominate their market as well too, because like buyers and sellers are there. Like if you want to sell, you gotta go where the buyers are. If you want to buy, you gotta go where the sellers are. Craigslist. And you see this in software platforms too, Windows and Office, right? They're still quite dominant because the applications and need for interoperability has what has kept people on these platforms. So like Craigslist is a favorite example of mine, because like look at their website. It looks like it's from 1999. Like we're all product managers. I bet all of you in 5 minutes can come up with at least 10 ways to improve this, right? It's hardly changed, but there's no serious competition here. So why is that, right? Because it's essentially a marketplace, and it's got a huge network effect. I want to buy something, I go to Craigslist. I want to buy a car or rent an apartment. That's where everything is, and it's the same thing for people who want to sell those things. So, like one way to apply this is to look at other industries. So, like, how strong do we think Uber's network effect is? Anyone?
They have like 90% of the market, so
Yeah,
it's
so
necessary.
So I think there is a strong network effect here. I might argue it's slightly less than other marketplaces, because like one of the value that I get if I'm a seller on eBay is I should theoretically get more money if there's more buyers competing to buy my stuff. And since they cap the price or they set the price, like it's less like a driver for Uber doesn't necessarily they can get more volume, but they don't the price is set. And drivers often drive for both Uber and Lyft, and they have low loyalty from drivers. And it's easy to switch. But on the other hand, right, you're right, they do have a lot of the market, because like it would be extraordinarily difficult today to start a new ride-sharing company, right? Like that, because you have to get the supply and demand at the same time. Both Uber and Lyft spend a ton of money doing that. And so the fact that some of these advantages are less might explain why it looks like a duopoly rather than like, say, eBay, which completely dominates auctions with no competitors. So the end result of the network effect is you end up with an industry structure where the winner takes all, or at least the majority of the value. And as a friend of mine told me, he's like, the problem with doing a consumer internet company is there's nonlinear outcome because of this in a lot of these areas, right? Leading companies, WhatsApp, Instagram, get huge exit with a higher per user value than like even the second place guy gets. And this is because of both of those have strong network effects. Okay, so the third area I want to talk about is differentiation. And differentiation is the one that should be near and dear to our hearts as product managers, because the question is, can your product create competitive advantage? And you can create it outside of what we traditionally think of product. Maybe your service and support is better, but can you have a better offering and get sustainable competitive advantage? So in the short run, yes, right? We can all find something to do to our products that our customers value, and we can maybe get them to pay for it, but is it sustainable? And then we're back to the question of, can our competitors copy what we've done? So I want to look at some examples where I think people did win on product. And Google is one of my favorite examples, and specifically Google Web Search. Because if we think about Web Search as an industry doesn't have a lot of these factors that we think would lead to a dominant, one player having a dominant outcome, right? It's super easy for consumers to switch. Like Bing's even 2 less characters. You can type it faster. I mean, there's no network effect. It doesn't matter to me what search engine my friends, my neighbors use. I'm just interested in my results and if I find stuff. Now, one could argue you get more data, like the more users you have, the more data you can have to refine your search results and figure out what people find useful, but it's very mild. The other thing a couple things that are interesting about this, Google was a late entrant. And I actually worked for a company that competed with Google back in the day. I worked for Ink2Me, which was, they provided a search engine, which later got sold to Yahoo. They provided it as kind of an OEM, like we'll search as a service. It's how we think about it today for portals. And then Microsoft spent a ton of money to compete with them, right? It's not like and Microsoft, it wasn't for lack of resources. I remember when Microsoft was building the team for Bing. because I had worked at a search company, even though I didn't work on search, I had all these recruiters calling me because they would see this on the resume. And they were like, no, you should apply. They're really willing to pay a lot of money. And I'm like, they also wanted you to move to Redmond, so it wasn't that interesting to me. But it wasn't but the point here is it wasn't for lack of trying. And so the interesting thing is Google has maintained the best results. That's why we all use it. Once in a while I try to go use Bing, and I'm like, no, the results are still better on Google. And so this is not a outcome that is kind of explainable by anything other than it's just a better product. And so then the question becomes, why has Microsoft not been able to imitate them? My best answer to that is that search is actually a really hard problem. And Google was exceptionally good at solving it.
So would you classify it as a sustainable competitive advantage?
Yeah, they've been doing it for like 10 years more, right? No one's on the horizon, so it's sustained, and I can't see any reason why that advantage is going to go away. So another one I like to talk about is Netflix. And I like this is a specific area. So this was like Netflix streaming before they started to, before the streaming market became a lot about original content. Like Netflix started original content in 2013, and they had a lot of competition. Amazon, all the pay TV vendors would stream you content. But back in that era, the thing that was really notable for Netflix was that their user experience was a lot better. Like if you tried to use like a cable box from that era, they're terrible. They're still not that good. So a couple other interesting things they did is they were really good at getting distribution, like every device you can think of, and they were radically higher value than like cable TV. So you're talking $10, but Amazon bundled it with Prime. So one of the ways they got to their dominance in this area was having a better user experience. Yeah, the market changed, and now it's about how many billions of dollars you can spend on can you produce really high quality original content. But I think this is a story where their ability to do a better product really got them to a good position. The other one I like to look at is Dropbox. And I can look at this from an earlier era as well, because again, this market has changed a lot. But if you go back to like 2008 when Dropbox launched, they had tons of competition, right? There's so many companies out there. In fact, at that time I was working for AOL and I bought Xdrive, so I was somewhat familiar with that market. It was really low barriers to entry. You buy a bunch of storage servers, you put some front end on it so that it, so they can communicate with file protocols. So there's so many people in this market. So why did Dropbox win? They had the best user experience. It's well integrated into the operating system, and it just worked. The other thing they did was really smart, was they did viral growth through referrals. Refer your friends and you get free storage. But your competitors can copy that too. And so I really recommend looking at Dropbox's founder, Drew Houston's slide deck here, because he goes through this in quite a bit of detail. He's got these funny examples about why, like, he'd go to venture capitalists and they're like, why would I fund this? There's 16 other companies. He's like, do you use any of them? Venture capitalist says, no. Well, he's like, that's why, because no one's built one that's good enough yet. And one of the conclusions he comes out with is that building a bulletproof, scalable, cross-platform storage architecture is hard. And that was kind of the story for Google too. That like some of these hard problems might be really hard to imitate. Like other people can't just go out and solve them. If you're doing something that's like some iPhone app that does something useful, but is not particularly hard, like your developer can build it in 2 months, right? Well, that's something that people can imitate. Like building a great file sharing service or building Google's web search is hard. The summary here is it's rare, and here I say too, it might be like the question is, why can't other people do things that are hard? It sounds just like search is a technically hard problem. I think maybe we have to build a culture around it that creates a superior product. There's probably a bunch of reasons why it's hard to build cultures and organizations that create superior products. And one of my theories here is that kind of how we think about, like, businesses think about revenue on like a quarterly basis gets in the way of this. Going the wrong way here. And there's kind of a fun quote that says, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." So in a lot of ways, like even if your intent is to build, Bing's intent is to build something better than Google, right? If they don't build the culture around it. It's funny because that quote's attributed to Peter Drucker, but it's actually, I went and researched it, and it was actually from a guy at Ford Motor Company. Like most quotes I researched, you can never prove they're said by the person they're supposed to research. I was supposed to set it. So the final topic I want to cover is disruption. And disruption is is like this buzzword now in Silicon Valley. The keynote speaker this morning talked about this too. Everyone's like, oh, I'm going to go disrupt my competitor, right? I'll lower my prices. That will disrupt them. But that's not what we're talking about when it comes to like disruptive innovation. Like disruption is not something your competitor has to respond to. The kind of disruption I'm talking about is something that reshapes the entire industry. And so it really breaks down long-running competitive advantages. And so I got this definition here: creates a new market by applying a different set of values, which ultimately unexpectedly takes over an existing market. And I think the unexpected part's important, right? Because if there's an innovation that everyone can see is better, right? This goes back to this imitation thing. Everyone adopts it, right? The markets where you see big disruptions, because the incumbents didn't realize that that innovation would fundamentally reshape the market, and there's a key reason for it. And this really defines disruptive innovation. And innovation is not disruptive unless it's worse in some way, on at least like one performance axis. Because what happens is often existing customers don't want that, because their performance goes down. But there's a new group of people who the innovation is valuable to. Often it's much cheaper, but we'll see that it doesn't have to be. That's one of the things about disruption. Sometimes it's cheaper, sometimes it's not, but often it is. There's a bunch of good examples of this. Clayton Christensen is the Harvard professor who came up with this theory, and his favorite example is hard disk drives. So there have been this whole generations of hard disk drive companies. And again, it's going to seem a little archaic because we're now in a flash storage world, but like we started off with like 8-inch disk drives that went into mainframes, right? And then many computers come along, and you get these like 5-inch disk drives. Right? Maybe the mainframes were 11, but the physical size keeps going down with every new generation of computers. And what is curious about this is that every generation of disk drive size has a new set of companies. The old ones didn't manage to move to the new size in time, and the reason is that these companies would go ask their customers, right? Like in the mini computer days, like they have these, if they were 8-inch drives, they'd be like, do you want these 5-inch drives that are going to PCs? And their best customers are always like, no. They're slower, they have less storage, I don't want them, right? And so the disk drive company says, no, we shouldn't build that. We asked our customers. They don't like this at all. They said build a faster, bigger disk drive, right? But there was this essentially disruption going on where these worse things would eventually take over. Another great example of this is BlackBerry, right? I used to have a BlackBerry, and that email experience on the BlackBerry is better than the email experience on my iPhone. It's the best email experience I have ever used because the keyboard made it better. Now, I don't have a BlackBerry any longer. I haven't had one for a long time, right? The touch interface was disruptive. It's worse for email. That was BlackBerry's primary use case. And I'm sure when the iPhone came out, BlackBerry went around and asked all their best customers, do you want a touchscreen? And they all said no, because they had bought the BlackBerries because they were good at email. And so what does BlackBerry do? They don't respond quickly. Well, it turns out that touch interface is still worse at email, but it's really good for other things. And so the whole industry moves. BlackBerry responds way too slowly and effectively like disappears, right? And then like once they get behind the 8 ball, it gets even worse for them, right? Because there's a network effect on computing platforms, right? When it comes to applications, right? Developers build for iPhone and Android, and so once the market takes off in that direction, they can't even catch up anymore. Like even if they'd gotten religion earlier and been like, no, it's not about keyboards anymore. Like unless if they would have had to have done that before the application base really develops on those other platforms. So if you're interested in disruption, you should definitely read Clayton Christensen's book on it called Innovator's Dilemma. It's one of the best books on strategy I have read, because he really goes into this in depth, and especially here in Silicon Valley, right? Because it gives you a good basis for understanding, like, what disruptive innovation is. Not like I changed my marketing message on disrupting the competitor. Now these are serious changes in the market. So in summary, right? We want to create added value because that's what you can use to capture above average returns for your product. Talked about 3 sources of competitive advantage: lower costs, network effects, and differentiation. And then finally, like, disruptive innovation destroys deep-seated strategic advantages. So if you are an incumbent in an industry with a good position, right, you should be on the lookout for disruption, because it doesn't come along that often, but when it does, it can really take away all your competitive advantages. So the Product Camp organizers asking people to vote or survey on the sessions. So please do that at the Product Camp website, and now we're open for questions.
So you said that competitors will imitate on your strategy, which is working good on all that. So how we can go ahead of that kind of competition if your competitor is?
Well, so that's the question, right? So either you can find some advantage like the network effect, which they can't copy. Like once you've got that, like you get, like, social network has that user base, it's impossible to enter. But most of us aren't blessed with that. So right, you have to find something that they can't do or won't do. Like won't do usually, like sometimes you can pick a positioning that is kind of antithetical to their core market or their core segment, which they can't chase after because it's going to dilute their message. But otherwise it's these examples where you have to do something that is sort of hard enough or unique enough to be hard to copy. Clayton Christensen, after disruption, he started talking about this jobs to be done theory of innovation, and one of his contentions is that it's hard, like if you really organize around the customer job, that doing that successfully is hard because it requires transforming your whole organization, but that also makes it hard to imitate.
Currently in the food and beverage space, when you talk to VCs, you hear constantly, we're not bullish on this. The unit economics are hard, the unit economics are hard, the unit economics are hard. Are there ways, you keep hearing it's hard, but you don't hear that there's a solution. What's holding that back? What is a challenge? And if you don't have the functional experience, maybe this isn't the right question, but I'm trying to understand why everyone is focused on the unit economics versus the culture and the process and the improvements that you can be able to make that put you in the differentiation of the other areas.
Yeah, so my first thought is who you're talking to, right? VCs, like if you look at their whole economic model, they're like, I don't care if 90% of the companies I fund fail, I want some that have like these huge home runs. And like the huge home runs have often been in things where the unit economics improve at scale. Like software, it always tends to improve at scale. I mean, even SaaS businesses, right? Because you only need so much engineering to produce a product to satisfy that market, and your margins are fairly high, right? Versus like food and beverage, where your cost of goods sold, I don't know it well enough to say what's a good.
Take Uber Eats as an example. Take Uber Eats as an example.
Uber Eats, yeah. Well, so that kind of example though, is it like really like how profitable is like food delivery? Because the question is, it goes back to this value question, right? That individually delivering stuff, right, is going to have a certain cost in it. How much are people willing to pay for it? Like FedEx and UPS do better at scale because they can like run one truck through the neighborhood on a route all day and service a whole bunch of customers. But like food, perishable, you want it hot, it's got to go point to point. So I mean in that question, I would wonder if is there a huge sustainable business that you can build on Like, it's not even so much a question of competition, it's that willingness of the customer to pay.
What might be a better question then is think about taking someone that has the equipment to become, I'm just gonna straight out lay it out, someone who is a good cook that could be a caterer, doesn't know what to do or the work to be able to do a caterer, and we can turn them into a caterer.
Okay.
So instead, it's much more about enabling the business and to be able to perform rather than doing direct food delivery.
Okay. Oh, yeah. And so then I would wonder, like, does that have the potential to be a multi-billion-dollar home run? Because that's what these VCs are looking for, right? They're not looking for something that, like, I can get a good return on. It may be a very good business. They may just not be the right people to fund it, because they're all interested in those multi-billion-dollar home runs. Other questions?
Which of the three sources of competitive advantage would you put premium car manufacturers in? Thinking of Mercedes and BMW, for example. Clearly, they're not cost advantage. Network effect doesn't really come into play here.
There might be a negative network effect on premium cars, because like, it's part of that brand value. You don't want it's not as good as everyone else has it.
But yet they're able to maintain pretty high margins, and yet you see multiple players in that market, again, able to capture value and maintain that value in the form of higher margins, such as Audi and Tesla and possibly a couple of American names, and the Japanese Acura, Lexus. So I'm wondering if differentiation really applies here.
Well, so I think it does. I mean, one of the ways luxury cars are differentiated is just on the brand aspect of it, right? The product's also differentiated. You've got people who are high willingness to pay, right? Because a Honda Accord or Toyota Camry is perfectly good transportation, right? It actually meet your needs well. So it's sort of chasing this higher set of needs. So I guess the question is why are the margins better? And I guess that comes down to pricing behavior, right? I mean, like Lexus, when they introduced, right, they were really underpricing Mercedes, and then Toyota just decided, well, like maybe because the volume is so limited, like there's really only so many people are going to buy a luxury car, that the returns are higher if pricing higher. I mean, that would be my guess, is that just because of the, like, typically people cut prices because the increase in share they can win in that volume gives them more net profit, but I'm guessing that's not the case in luxury cars. Like once you cross a certain threshold, there's only so many people willing to buy those cars. And they may not be particularly price sensitive.
Probably, yeah.
Like versus if you look at like the core auto market, right, margins are nowhere near as good on like your sort of family sedan class, but there's a lot of competition and customers are price sensitive. Cool. Any other questions? Not. Thank you all for listening.